The champagne flutes froze mid-air. Veronica Hayes, tech billionaire in a $15,000 gown, had just sneered at the server, refilling her glass loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "Typical uneducated help," she'd said, waving him away like a fly. "Probably can't even spell entrepreneur." Laughter rippled through the crystal chandeliered room, a symphony of designer suits and borrowed confidence. But Kyle Bennett didn't flinch. He simply turned to the Chinese delegates at the next table and spoke fluid Mandarin pouring from his lips like water, then French to the Parisians, Japanese to the Tokyo investors, German, Arabic, Russian, 7 languages in 90 seconds. The laughter died. Veronica's face drained of color, because the man she'd just humiliated wasn't just a server, he was someone who'd once negotiated peace treaties in Geneva. And tonight, in front of her most important guests, he was about to remind her that education isn't measured by bank accounts. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom glittered like a jewelry box tipped on its side. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors polished to mirrors, reflecting the cream of San Francisco's elite in their tailored tuxedos and couture gowns. Veronica Hayes stood at the center of it all, holding court like a queen among her subjects. Her annual Global Innovation Gala attracted power players from 6 continents, tech moguls, venture capitalists, diplomatic envoys, and old money aristocrats who still believed their blood ran bluer than everyone else's. The guest list read like a United Nations roster crossed with a Forbes ranking. Chinese manufacturing titans mingled with French luxury brand CEOs. Japanese technology investors traded business cards with German automotive executives. Russian oil magnates laughed with Arab real estate developers. The air hummed with a dozen languages, each conversation worth millions in potential deals. And weaving through this constellation of wealth and influence, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, moved the invisible workforce that made such evenings possible. Kyle Bennett adjusted his bow tie for the 100th time that evening, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar fabric. The server's uniform felt stiff and foreign against his skin, nothing like the custom suits he'd once worn to diplomatic summits. But those days belonged to a different man, a different life. Now he was just another face in the background, refilling glasses and clearing plates while billionaires discussed changing the world. He'd taken this catering gig 3 weeks ago, needing the extra cash before Owen's birthday. His 9-year-old son had asked for a new bicycle, the kind with gears and handbrakes that all the other kids rode to school. Kyle had smiled and promised, knowing it meant picking up weekend shifts on top of his weekday work at the community center. Single fatherhood ran on sacrifice and late nights, on swallowing pride and doing whatever it took. The pay was decent, the hours brutal, but he'd learned to find dignity in honest work, any honest work that let him be home for breakfast and bedtime stories. The evening had started simply enough. Kyle kept his head down, his movements efficient and unobtrusive. He'd mastered the art of invisibility over the past 5 years, of being present but unnoticed. It was safer that way, easier than the alternative, but old habits died hard, and he couldn't help listening as he moved through the crowd. His ears caught fragments of conversation in Mandarin, debates in French, negotiations in German. The languages washed over him like familiar songs, stirring memories he'd tried to bury. He heard a Japanese investor struggling to explain a concept to his American counterpart, watched a French delegate growing frustrated with a translator's incompetence, noticed an elderly Chinese couple sitting alone at their table looking lost and overwhelmed. Something tightened in his chest, that old instinct to help, to bridge gaps, to make people understand each other. He pushed it down and kept walking. That wasn't his job anymore. That wasn't who he was supposed to be. Veronica Hayes commanded attention the way black holes commanded light inevitably and completely. She'd built her tech empire from a dorm room algorithm into a $15 billion corporation, and she never let anyone forget it. Her success had polished away whatever humility she might have once possessed, replacing it with the gleaming armor of certainty that came with conquering markets and crushing competitors. She spoke in sound bites designed for TED Talks, her gestures practiced for maximum impact. Tonight she was entertaining potential investors from Beijing, explaining her company's expansion plans with the confidence of someone who'd never heard the word no in a context that mattered. Kyle approached her table carefully, champagne bottle in hand. He'd served her twice already that evening, each time earning nothing but a dismissive wave. The third time proved different. "Excuse me, ma'am," Kyle said quietly, reaching to refill her glass. His hand was steady despite the fatigue pulling at his shoulders. Veronica didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence except to continue her sentence mid-thought. But as he poured, a drop of champagne caught the light and fell, missing her glass by inches. It landed on the white tablecloth, a tiny golden stain spreading across the fabric. The conversation stopped. Veronica's eyes snapped to the spot, then traveled up to Kyle's face with the slow, withering assessment of someone evaluating an insect. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. The temperature around the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kyle saw it coming, that particular expression he'd learned to recognize on the faces of those who measured worth in zeros and viewed everyone else as scenery. "Good Lord," Veronica said, her voice carrying across 3 nearby tables. She set down her glass with deliberate precision. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." She turned to her guests, gesturing at Kyle like he was an exhibit in a museum of failure. "The education crisis in this country. Look at this man, can't even pour champagne without making a mess. Typical, uneducated help." She waved her hand dismissively, shooing him away as if he were a persistent fly. "Probably can't even spell entrepreneur, let alone understand what we're discussing up here." Laughter erupted around her, a cascade of expensive dental work and practiced social cruelty. Men in $1,000 suits chuckled into their drinks. Women in jewelry worth more than cars covered their smiles with manicured hands. The mockery spread like ripples in a pond, each laugh validating the next, creating a symphony of borrowed confidence and inherited superiority. Kyle felt dozens of eyes on him, measuring him, dismissing him, finding him wanting. For 3 heartbeats, Kyle stood frozen. Heat crept up his neck, familiar and unwelcome. This was the part where he was supposed to apologize, bow his head, and fade back into invisibility. That was the script for people like him: accept the humiliation, cash the paycheck, go home. 5 years ago, he would have done exactly that. 5 years ago, he'd been too broken to do anything else. But something shifted in that moment between Veronica's laughter and the crowd's response. Maybe it was exhaustion with being small. Maybe it was the memory of Owen asking him that morning if he was proud of his work. Maybe it was the ghost of Jennifer whispering in his ear the way she used to. "Don't let them make you forget who you are." Or maybe it was simply that he'd looked past Veronica's shoulder and seen the elderly Chinese couple again, still sitting alone, their confusion now mixed with embarrassment at the scene unfolding before them. They reminded him too much of delegates he'd once helped, of people who just needed someone to see them as human. Kyle took a breath and turned, not away, but toward the table beside Veronica's where the Chinese delegation sat. The elderly couple looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across their faces. And then Kyle spoke. The Mandarin rolled off his tongue like he'd never stopped using it, fluid and natural with the precise Beijing accent that marked formal diplomatic training. "Qing yuan liang wamen de shibai. Ninsu yao shen mama?" He asked if they needed anything, his tone respectful and warm. The woman's eyes widened. Her husband sat up straighter, relief washing over his weathered features. They answered in rapid Mandarin, explaining they'd been trying to communicate with the staff all evening. Kyle listened, nodded, then translated their requests to a passing waiter in perfect English before turning back to reassure them in their own language. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if the past 5 years had been erased and he was back in a Geneva conference room making sure everyone felt heard. But he didn't stop there. Kyle shifted his attention to the French delegates 2 tables over, who were locked in what appeared to be a heated disagreement with their German business partners. He approached and addressed them in flawless Parisian French, asking if he could be of assistance. Puis-je vous aider, monsieur? Monsieur? The French CEO blinked at him, fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Kyle switched to German, repeating the offer. Kann ich Ihnen behilflich sein? The German executive actually dropped his napkin. Within seconds, Kyle was facilitating their conversation, translating not just words but intent, smoothing over cultural misunderstandings that their paid interpreter had bungled. He explained the French position in German, then the German concerns in French, finding the common ground that had been hiding in plain sight. The disagreement dissolved into nods and handshakes, a potential partnership saved by someone they'd barely noticed existed. The ballroom had gone quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned to follow this impossible scene. Kyle moved through the space with the ease of someone who belonged there, addressing the Japanese investors in their language, discussing technical specifications with the precision of someone who understood both the words and the concepts behind them. He helped the Russian delegation clarify a contract point, his Russian carrying the slight Moscow accent that marked him as seriously trained. He chatted with the Arab sheikh's wife in Arabic, making her laugh at a cultural observation that showed deep familiarity with Middle Eastern diplomatic protocol. And with each language, each connection, the collective shock in the room grew thicker. Phones appeared, recording this surreal moment. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who was this man? How was this possible? The server in the cheap tuxedo was speaking 7 languages with the fluency of a native speaker, switching between them as easily as changing channels on a television. Veronica Hayes stood frozen, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. The color had drained from her face, leaving her makeup stark against pale skin. Around her, her guests leaned forward with open fascination, no longer interested in her sales pitch. Their attention had shifted entirely to Kyle, drawn by the magnetic force of witnessing something extraordinary in an unexpected package. One of the Chinese investors, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, suddenly straightened in his chair. He stared at Kyle with growing recognition, his expression cycling through disbelief, certainty, and then pure astonishment. "Tian Na," he breathed, loud enough for his table to hear. "Kyle Bennett? From Geneva?" The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Another guest gasped, a Japanese woman who'd been watching Kyle with intense focus. "The UN interpreter? The one who mediated the trade summit in 2018? The revelation rippled outward in waves. Those old enough to remember the diplomatic circuits began murmuring, pulling out phones to search for confirmation. Kyle Bennett, the name attached to 6 major international agreements. The interpreter who'd been called a linguistic genius by The Economist, who'd worked the highest levels of diplomatic negotiation before vanishing from the scene 5 years ago. Speculation had ranged from burnout to scandal, but he'd simply disappeared from the international stage as completely as if he'd never existed. And here he was, wearing a catering uniform, serving champagne at a tech gala. The disconnect between expectation and reality created a kind of cognitive whiplash. People stared at him with new eyes, seeing past the costume to the person underneath. Veronica's face had progressed from pale to flushed, red creeping up her neck like a thermometer measuring rising shame. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Around her, the laughter had died completely, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that acknowledged without stating that something terrible had just happened. Kyle finished his conversation with the Arab delegation and straightened, meeting Veronica's eyes across the space between them. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at her discomfort, just a quiet dignity that made her elaborate gown and perfect makeup look somehow cheap in comparison. "I apologize for the spill, Miss Hayes," he said in English, his voice calm and professional. "It won't happen again." He picked up his champagne bottle and tray, ready to return to his duties as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But before he could move, the Chinese investor who'd recognized him stood up. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "Please, you remember me? Chen Wei, from the Shanghai negotiations?" Kyle paused, then nodded slowly. "Of course, Mr. Chen. It's good to see you again. Chen Wei broke into a wide smile and crossed the space between them, hand extended. What are you doing here? We thought you had left the field. Everyone has been asking about you. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Kyle shook the offered hand, aware of every eye in the ballroom tracking his movements. This was the moment he'd avoided for 5 years, the reckoning with his past, the explanation of his fall from grace. But standing there, with the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides, he found he no longer cared about hiding. Jennifer's face floated through his mind, her smile when she'd told him the only opinion that mattered was Owen's. Life changed, Kyle said simply. I have a son. He needed me more than the summits did. Chen Wei's expression softened with understanding. He nodded slowly, respect replacing curiosity. A good father is worth more than 100 diplomats. He turned to address the room, his voice carrying authority. This man helped negotiate 3 major trade agreements. He speaks 12 languages, not 7. He has forgotten more about international relations than most of us will ever know. We are honored to have him here. The applause started slowly, uncertain at first, then built into something genuine. Guests rose from their seats, phones still recording, but now the energy had shifted from mockery to admiration. The Japanese investors bowed slightly in Kyle's direction. The French delegation raised their glasses. Even the Russians, not known for easy sentiment, nodded with appreciation. Only Veronica remained frozen at her table, trapped in the prison of her own making. Her perfectly orchestrated evening had become about someone else entirely, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The woman who'd built an empire on disrupting established systems had just been disrupted by the man she'd dismissed as beneath notice. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her glass, and Kyle saw something in her eyes. He recognized the vertigo of realizing you'd made a terrible mistake in front of an audience that would never forget. Other guests began approaching Kyle, introducing themselves or reintroducing in cases where their paths had crossed before. A French ambassador pulled him aside to ask about his current situation. A German CEO pressed a business card into his hand, insisting they talk about consulting opportunities. The Arab sheikh's wife thanked him profusely for making her feel welcome in a room that had largely ignored her. Job offers materialized from thin air translation services, diplomatic consulting, corporate negotiation facilitation. Numbers were mentioned that made Kyle's head spin, salaries that would change everything for him and Owen overnight. But with each offer, Kyle felt the old anxiety rising. These were the golden handcuffs he'd escaped, the life that had cost him Jennifer. These positions meant travel, meant missing Owen's soccer games and parent-teacher conferences, meant choosing between being excellent at his career and being present for his son. He'd already made that choice once, and Jennifer had paid the price. I appreciate all the offers, Kyle said carefully, addressing the small crowd that had formed around him. But I have commitments I can't break. My son needs stability. A murmur of understanding rippled through the group. Chen Wei nodded thoughtfully. What about remote work? Translation can be done from anywhere now. Legal documents, technical manuals, conference calls, no travel required. Kyle hesitated. That was different. That was the kind of work he could do from home, during Owen's school hours, without sacrificing presence for paycheck. It was the solution he'd never thought to look for, because he'd been too busy surviving to imagine thriving. I could do that, he said slowly. On a freelance basis, project by project. The offers refined themselves instantly. Hourly rates, retainer agreements, specific projects that needed his expertise. The German CEO mentioned a merger requiring document translation. The French ambassador talked about an upcoming summit needing remote interpretation services. Even the Japanese investors had materials that needed expert handling. Veronica watched this impromptu job fair with an expression that cycled through emotions too quickly to name. Shame warred with pride. Humiliation fought with the ingrained instinct to control the narrative. She'd spent the evening being the center of attention, the one everyone wanted to impress. Now, she was reduced to a spectator in her own event, watching a man she'd mocked become the most sought-after person in the room. When the crowd around Kyle finally thinned, she stood and walked toward him on legs that looked unsteady despite her expensive heels. The ballroom fell silent again, everyone sensing the confrontation that had to come. Veronica stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak privately but not so close as to invade his space. Up close, Kyle could see the fine lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide, the tension in her jaw that spoke of someone who'd armored herself so thoroughly she'd forgotten how to be vulnerable. "Mr. Bennett," she began, and her voice cracked slightly on his name. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I owe you an apology. What I said was inexcusable. I made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice, and I humiliated you in front of everyone here." The words came out stiff, unpracticed, as if apologies were a language she'd never quite learned. But Kyle heard the genuineness, underneath the awkwardness. Saw the cost of this admission written in the tightness around her mouth. "I was wrong about you. About what education means. About measuring people's worth based on their occupation." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor revealing the person underneath. "I built my whole company on the idea that we should disrupt conventional thinking, but I just proved I'm as conventional and narrow-minded as the people I claim to be better than." Kyle studied her for a long moment, weighing his response. He could make this hurt more, could twist the knife of her embarrassment and enjoy her discomfort. Part of him wanted to the part that still remembered the laughter, the casual cruelty of her dismissal. But he thought about Owen, about the conversations they'd had about treating people with kindness even when it was hard. He thought about Jennifer, who'd always believed in second chances and growth. And he thought about himself, about the man he wanted to be for his son. "I accept your apology," he said quietly. "We all make mistakes. The question is what we learn from them." Veronica's shoulders sagged with relief, some of the tension leaving her body. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" Kyle considered that. An idea had been forming in his mind while he listened to the job offers, something Jennifer would have loved. "Actually, there is," Kyle said. "I lost my wife 5 years ago. She was a teacher, believed everyone deserved access to education regardless of their circumstances. If you really want to make this right, establish a scholarship fund in her name for single parents trying to further their education while raising kids. Help people who are working 2 or 3 jobs but still dream of something more." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Call it the Jennifer Bennett Scholarship. Make it enough to actually change lives, not just a token gesture. And maybe next time you see someone serving drinks or cleaning floors, remember they might have a story you don't know." Veronica nodded slowly, something like respect dawning in her expression. "The Jennifer Bennett Scholarship," she repeated. "I'll do it. A full program tuition, child care assistance, living expenses. I'll announce it tonight." She extended her hand, and Kyle shook it. The gesture felt like closing one chapter and opening another. The rest of the evening transformed into something Kyle had never anticipated. Word of the incident spread through the ballroom faster than champagne flowed, and suddenly he wasn't invisible anymore. Guests sought him out to introduce themselves properly, to apologize for their earlier laughter, to express admiration for his grace under pressure. The catering manager appeared at his elbow, flustered and apologetic, offering to let him leave early with full pay. But Kyle declined. He'd taken the job, and he'd finish it. There was dignity in completing what you started, regardless of what happened in the middle. He worked the rest of the shift with his head high, no longer trying to fade into the background. When guests addressed him now, he responded in their native languages, making connections that felt genuine rather than transactional. The elderly Chinese couple invited him to sit with them during his break, insisting on hearing about his son. The French delegates added him on LinkedIn. Even the Russian oil magnates offered a toast to the most educated man in the room, regardless of his uniform. When the gala finally wound down, Kyle changed out of his server's uniform in the staff locker room back into his worn jeans and the hoodie that Owen had picked out for him last Christmas. He felt lighter somehow, as if he'd put down a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The shame of the past 5 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had lost its stranglehold on his identity. He'd spent so long defining himself by what he'd lost: his career, his wife, his place in the world, that he'd forgotten what he still possessed. But tonight had reminded him he was still Kyle Bennett. Still the man who spoke 12 languages, who could bridge cultures and find common ground. That hadn't disappeared just because he'd chosen fatherhood over conference rooms. It had just been waiting for the right moment to resurface. As he walked toward the exit, his phone buzzed with a text from Owen's babysitter. His son was asleep but had insisted on staying up to hear about Dad's evening. Kyle smiled, already composing the story in his head, the one he'd tell at breakfast tomorrow morning. Chenwei caught up with Kyle in the lobby, slightly out of breath from hurrying. "Wait," the older man called. "I wanted to give you this before you left." He pressed a folder into Kyle's hands. "Inside is a contract for the Shanghai merger I mentioned. 6 months of work, all remote, very good pay. Take it home, read it over. No pressure, but we would be honored to work with you again." Kyle accepted the folder, feeling the weight of opportunity. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I'll review it carefully." Chen smiled and clasped Kyle's shoulder. "Your wife would be very proud of you tonight. The way you handled that situation with dignity, with grace. That is true education, the kind that cannot be taught in universities." He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know what the real gift is? Your son gets to learn from your example. That is worth more than any summit or negotiation." The words settled into Kyle's chest, warm and solid. He hadn't thought about it that way, that his choices weren't just about what he'd given up, but what he was giving Owen. A model of resilience, a demonstration that you could fall down and get back up, evidence that dignity wasn't tied to job titles or bank accounts. The night air hit Kyle's face as he stepped outside, cool and clean after hours in the overheated ballroom. He stood on the hotel steps for a moment, looking out at San Francisco's glittering skyline. Somewhere in that sprawl of light and shadow was his small apartment, where Owen slept dreaming whatever 9-year-olds dreamed about. Tomorrow morning they'd make pancakes together, the Saturday ritual that had sustained them through the hardest years. Owen would ask about the gala, and Kyle would tell him the truth, not a sanitized version, but the real story, how Dad had been mocked and found the courage to respond, how speaking up had changed everything, how sometimes the things you think you've lost forever are just waiting for the right moment to come back. He'd tell Owen about the scholarship in Mom's name, about how something good could come from something painful, and then they'd go to the bike shop, because Owen's birthday was coming and some promises were meant to be kept. 2 months passed like water through fingers, unremarkable except for how different everything felt. Kyle's freelance translation work materialized into steady income, the kind that paid bills without panic, that allowed for savings and small luxuries. He worked from home while Owen was at school, handling document translation and conference call interpretation. The work stretched his mind in ways he'd missed, reminding him why he'd loved this field in the first place. The intellectual challenge of not just translating words but translating meaning, context, cultural subtext. He'd forgotten how satisfying it was to find exactly the right phrase in another language, to build bridges of understanding between people who'd never have connected otherwise. And the best part was being present for Owen, walking him to school every morning, picking him up every afternoon, helping with homework at the kitchen table while dinner simmered on the stove. This was the balance he'd dreamed of but never believed possible. The Jennifer Bennett Scholarship launched with more fanfare than Kyle had anticipated. Veronica announced it at a press conference, explaining the inspiration behind it with surprising honesty. She told the story of the gala, of her mistake and what she'd learned. The media coverage was extensive. Local news picked it up, then national outlets. The story resonated. Tech billionaire learns humility from server who turned out to be diplomatic genius. It had all the elements of modern mythology: hubris, reversal, redemption. Kyle declined interview requests, preferring to stay out of the spotlight, but he attended the scholarship's inaugural ceremony. Watching the first 5 recipients receive their awards, single parents whose faces showed the same exhaustion and determination he knew so well, made his chest tight with emotion. Jennifer would have loved this. She'd always believed education was the great equalizer, that everyone deserved the chance to reach their potential regardless of their starting point. Owen's school presentation day arrived with the chaos typical of 4th-grade events. Parents crowded into the too small classroom, phones ready to record their children's moments of glory. Kyle sat in the back, having promised Owen he'd be there but wouldn't make a fuss. His son had been working on this project for weeks, practicing his speech in front of the bathroom mirror, arranging his poster board with the intensity of a museum curator. When Owen's turn came, he walked to the front of the class with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he wanted to say. His poster board featured photos of Kyle from his UN days, alongside more recent pictures, a visual timeline of transformation. "My dad, the humble polyglot," Owen announced, reading from his carefully printed cards. "A polyglot is someone who speaks many languages. My dad speaks 12. But the most important thing isn't how many languages he knows, it's that he uses them to help people understand each other." Owen's presentation captured his classmates' attention in a way that surprised even Kyle. He talked about how his dad used to work for the United Nations, negotiating peace and trade agreements, how everything changed when Mom died, and Dad chose to stay home to take care of him instead of traveling the world. Owen's voice wavered slightly when he mentioned Jennifer, but he pushed through. "My dad could have kept his important job," Owen continued, "but he decided I was more important. He worked regular jobs so he could be home every day. Some people thought that meant he wasn't smart anymore, but then he showed them being a good dad is the smartest thing anyone can do." Kyle felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized Owen understood so much about the sacrifice involved, about the choices that had shaped their life together. Owen finished by talking about the gala, about how Dad had stood up for himself and helped other people. "My dad taught me that education isn't just about schools," Owen concluded. "It's about learning to be kind and brave and true to yourself. And that's why he's my hero." The classroom erupted in applause. Parents who'd been checking their phones looked up with new interest. Owen's teacher wiped at her eyes discreetly, and Kyle sat in the back, overwhelmed by pride and love and the realization that he'd somehow managed to do the most important job right. After the presentations, parents clustered around Kyle with questions and congratulations. Some of them had seen the news coverage about the scholarship. Others were just impressed by Owen's obvious admiration for his father. A few single parents pulled him aside to talk about the challenges they faced, finding solidarity in shared experience. One mother mentioned she'd applied for the Jennifer Bennett scholarship, her voice thick with hope. Kyle encouraged her, meant it, and felt Jennifer's presence in the conversation, her belief that everyone deserved support and second chances. That evening, Kyle and Owen sat on their apartment's small balcony, sharing ice cream and watching the sun set over the city. It had become their ritual for celebrating good days, this quiet time of connection without screens or distractions. Owen kicked his legs against the balcony railing, contentment radiating from his small frame. "Did you like my presentation?" he asked, chocolate ice cream smudging his upper lip. Kyle smiled and wiped it away with his thumb. "I loved it. You made me sound much better than I am." Owen shook his head seriously. "I just told the truth. You are that good." He paused, considering his next words. "Do you ever miss your old job? The important one?" It was a question Kyle had asked himself countless times, usually in the dark hours before dawn when doubts crept in. But sitting here with his son, the answer came easily. "Sometimes I miss parts of it," Kyle admitted. "The challenge, the feeling of solving big problems, but I don't miss it more than I love being with you." He pulled Owen closer, feeling the solid weight of his son against his side. "Those jobs will always be there. But you're only 9 once. I'm not missing that for anything." Owen nodded, satisfied with this answer. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue. Then Owen spoke again, his voice small but determined. "When I grow up, I want to help people like you do, but I'll use my words to make things better." Kyle's heart swelled. "You're already doing that, buddy. Every day." And it was true. Owen's kindness at school, his willingness to help struggling classmates, his insistence on including the lonely kids at recess, these were translations of a different kind, building bridges just as surely as his father had done in Geneva conference rooms. 3 months after the gala, Kyle received an unexpected invitation. Veronica's company was hosting a smaller, more intimate gathering for the scholarship recipients and their donors. She'd specifically requested Kyle's presence, not as staff but as an honored guest. He almost declined. The memory of that night still carried an edge of discomfort, but something made him accept. Maybe curiosity about how Veronica had processed the experience. Maybe a desire for closure on that chapter of his life. He borrowed a decent suit from his neighbor, dropped Owen off with his reliable babysitter, and took the bus to the venue. The event was nothing like the gala, 50 people instead of 500, elegant but understated, focused on conversation rather than spectacle. Veronica spotted him immediately and made her way over, her expression open and genuine in a way it hadn't been before. "Kyle," she said, and this time his name sounded natural in her mouth. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." She looked different, somehow less polished, more human. Her dress was expensive but not ostentatious, her makeup subtle. "I wanted you to meet the scholarship recipients, to see what your words that night set in motion." She guided him through the room, introducing him to 5 remarkable individuals. Each one was juggling school, work, and children with the kind of determination Kyle recognized in his own mirror. A nursing student who worked nights as a hospital janitor, an engineering major doing overnight stocking at a grocery store, a law school hopeful balancing 3 part-time jobs, a computer science student cleaning offices before dawn, an education major serving tables between classes. They all thanked him, their gratitude genuine and overwhelming. One woman, the nursing student, clasped his hands and said, "You gave us visibility, made people see that we're not just workers, we're human beings with dreams." Her words echoed through Kyle's chest, validating every difficult choice he'd made. Veronica pulled him aside after the introductions, to a quiet corner where they could talk privately. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," she said without preamble. "About the person I was and the person I want to be." She looked out at the gathering, at the scholarship recipients networking with donors. "I built my company on being the smartest person in every room, on never showing weakness or doubt, but that night taught me I'd been measuring the wrong things." She turned back to Kyle, her expression serious. "Education isn't about credentials or titles. It's about wisdom, empathy, the courage to keep learning from your mistakes. You have more of that than anyone I know." She paused, then added quietly, "I established 2 more scholarships after the Jennifer Bennett. One for children of service workers pursuing STEM fields, another for immigrants working on language certifications. Both fully funded for 10 years. Kyle felt emotion rise in his throat. This was more than he'd hoped for, more than Jennifer could have dreamed. "She would have been so happy," he managed. "Thank you." Veronica shook her head. "Thank you for having the grace to teach me something I should have learned decades ago, for showing me that humility isn't weakness, it's strength." She hesitated, then asked the question Kyle had been expecting. "Are you happy now? With how things turned out?" Kyle thought about Owen's presentation, about their ice cream evenings, about the quiet satisfaction of tucking his son into bed every night. He thought about the translation work that challenged his mind without consuming his soul. He thought about Jennifer's scholarship changing lives, her legacy growing in ways she'd never imagined. "Yeah," he said honestly. "I'm happy. It took me a long time to get here, but I am." The evening wound down with the soft warmth of connection rather than the sharp glitter of networking. Kyle exchanged contact information with several scholarship recipients, promising to help with language skills or translation advice if they needed it. One of the donors, a venture capitalist who'd been at the gala, approached him with a business proposition. "I've been thinking about this for months," the man said. "What if we created a consulting firm specifically for people like you? Parents with high-level skills who need flexible work. We could connect them with companies needing their expertise on a project basis. Remote work, fair pay, respectful conditions." He handed Kyle a business card. "I'd like you to help me design it. Use your experience to make sure we get it right." Kyle accepted the card, intrigued. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Jennifer would have encouraged him to explore, something that could help others while respecting his priorities. The last surprise of the evening came as Kyle was preparing to leave. Veronica approached him one final time, carrying a wrapped package. "This is for Owen," she said, "from all of us." Kyle unwrapped it carefully to find a top-of-the-line bicycle, the exact model his son had been dreaming about, complete with gears and handbrakes and racing stripes. But more than that, attached to the handlebars was a small plaque. "For Owen Bennett, whose father taught us that the most important education happens at home. May you always remember that who you are matters more than what you do." Kyle stared at it, overwhelmed. "This is too much," he protested, but Veronica shook her head firmly. "It's not enough. It will never be enough to make up for what I said, but it's a start." She smiled, and it reached her eyes. "Besides, your son's presentation is on YouTube. The whole company watched it. We figured any kid who defends his father like that deserves the bike of his dreams." Kyle rode the bus home that night with the bicycle secured in the luggage area, his mind full of the evening's connections and possibilities. He thought about how one moment of standing up for himself had cascaded into opportunities he'd never imagined. Not just for him, but for Owen, for the scholarship recipients, for countless others who might benefit from the ripples spreading outward. Jennifer had always believed in the butterfly effect, that small actions could have enormous consequences if they touched the right hearts at the right time. Tonight had proven her right in ways that would have delighted her analytical mind and generous spirit. He imagined her reaction to all of it. The scholarship in her name, Owen's fierce pride, the bicycle waiting to surprise their son tomorrow morning. She'd probably cry, then laugh, then make him promise to teach Owen proper bike safety before letting him ride. The apartment was quiet when Kyle returned, Owen long since asleep. The babysitter left with a smile and a wave. Kyle wheeled the bicycle into the living room, positioning it where Owen would see it first thing in the morning. He stood back and admired it, not just the bike itself, but what it represented. A promise kept, a community that had shown up, proof that good things could emerge from painful moments if you had the courage to stand up and the grace to forgive. He thought about the server uniform he'd worn that night at the gala, how invisible he'd felt in it. But invisibility had only been his perception. He'd never actually disappeared, he'd just been waiting for the moment when his gifts would be needed again. And when that moment came, he'd been ready, not because he'd been planning for it, but because he'd never really lost who he was. He'd just learned to carry it differently. Kyle walked to Owen's room and eased open the door. His son slept, sprawled across his bed, blankets kicked off, stuffed animals scattered like a small plush army. Kyle pulled the covers back over him, brushed hair off his forehead, and just watched for a moment. This was the important work, not the summits or the negotiations or the translation of trade agreements. This raising a kind, brave, thoughtful human being, teaching him through example that you could be knocked down and get back up. That dignity wasn't given by others but claimed for yourself. That education came in countless forms, and the most valuable lessons often came from the hardest experiences. Owen stirred slightly, mumbling something in his sleep. Kyle leaned down and whispered, "I love you, buddy. Thank you for being my reason." Then he slipped out quietly, leaving the door cracked open the way Owen preferred. In his own room, Kyle prepared for bed with the tired satisfaction of a day well lived. He passed Jennifer's photo on the dresser, the one from their wedding day, her smile bright enough to light the world. He touched the frame gently. "We did okay today," he told her, like he did most nights. "Owen's growing up strong, The scholarship's changing lives, and I think I'm finally figuring out how to balance everything." He paused, imagining her response. She'd probably tease him about taking 5 years to figure out what she'd told him all along, that he didn't have to choose between his gifts and his family. He could be both translator and father, expert and parent. The trick was finding the right proportion, the sustainable rhythm that honored all parts of himself. Tonight felt like he'd finally found that balance. Sleep came easily for the first time in years, untroubled by anxiety about money or identity or whether he'd made the right choices. When morning arrived, Owen's shout of joy echoed through the apartment, loud enough to wake neighbors. Kyle stumbled into the living room to find his son already on the bicycle, riding circles around the furniture with abandon and delight. "Dad! Dad! This is the one I wanted! How did you? When did you? This is the best thing ever." Owen's grin could have powered the city. Kyle laughed and grabbed him for a hug, nearly getting knocked over by the bike's momentum. "Careful, champ. Let's take it outside before you crash into something." They spent the morning in the park, Kyle jogging alongside as Owen mastered his new wheels, both of them laughing until their sides hurt. Later, while Owen showed off his bike to friends at the playground, Kyle sat on a bench and watched. His phone buzzed with messages, follow-ups from the previous night, new project inquiries, updates from the scholarship committee. His calendar showed a healthy mix of translation work and Owen's activities: parent-teacher conferences, soccer games, birthday parties, client calls. It was full without being overwhelming, busy without being frantic. The life he'd stumbled into after Jennifer's death had transformed into something he'd actively chosen, actively built. And sitting there in the autumn sunshine, watching his son ride his new bicycle with pure joy, Kyle felt something he'd thought lost forever: contentment. Not the absence of grief Jennifer's loss would always ache, but the presence of peace. The knowledge that he'd honored her memory in the best way possible, by being the father she'd have wanted Owen to have. A year passed, then another. The scholarship fund grew, helping dozens of families transform their circumstances. Kyle's consulting work expanded into exactly the kind of flexible, meaningful employment he'd always wanted. He took on projects that challenged him intellectually while maintaining his commitment to being present for Owen's childhood. They developed routines and traditions, built a life that felt solid and good. Owen grew taller, more confident, started learning Spanish from Mrs. Rosa downstairs and asking questions about other languages. Kyle taught him basics in several tongues, watching with pride as his son's mind opened to the possibilities of communication across cultures. Sometimes Owen asked about Geneva, about the important work Dad used to do. Kyle told him stories, but always ended by saying the same thing: "That work was important, but you're more important. And the choice I made to be here with you is the one I'm most proud of." On the 5th anniversary of Jennifer's death, Kyle and Owen visited her grave as they did every year, but this time felt different. The sharp edge of grief had worn smooth through time and healing. They could talk about her now without crying, though sometimes they still did, and that was okay too. Owen placed flowers on her headstone, then stepped back to stand beside his father. "I told my class about Mom yesterday," he said quietly. "About how she was a teacher and how she believed everyone deserved to learn. My teacher said she sounded amazing." Kyle wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "She was. And she'd be so proud of you, of the person you're becoming." They stood there in comfortable silence, the autumn wind rustling leaves around them. Then Owen spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Dad, I think I understand now what you meant about choosing me over your job." Kyle looked down at him, curious. "Yeah?" Owen nodded. "You didn't give up who you were. You just changed how you used it. You're still the same person, just focused different." The wisdom in Owen's words hit Kyle like a revelation. That was exactly it, the thing he'd been trying to articulate for years. He hadn't stopped being Kyle Bennett, the interpreter and negotiator. He'd just refocused those skills toward the most important negotiation of his life: raising a good human being. Every conversation with Owen was a translation between adult understanding and childhood wonder. Every moment of discipline or guidance was a negotiation between what he needed to teach and what his son needed to learn. Every decision about work and life was a careful balance of conflicting priorities. He'd been using his gifts all along, just in ways that didn't come with recognition or prestige. "That's exactly right, buddy," Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion. "You just explained it better than I ever could." Owen grinned up at him. "Well, I learned from the best." They turned to leave, but Kyle paused for one last moment at Jennifer's grave. "Thank you," he whispered. "For Owen, for teaching me what matters, for everything." Then father and son walked back to their car, their shadows long in the afternoon sun. The world kept turning, seasons changing, life unfolding in its unpredictable way. Kyle's story became one of those urban legends that persisted in business circles, the cautionary tale of assumptions and prejudice, the inspiring narrative of hidden talent revealed. But for Kyle himself, the night at the gala became just one moment in a much longer journey. Yes, it had changed things, opened doors, created opportunities, connected him with people who valued his skills. But the real transformation had begun 5 years earlier, when he'd made the choice to put Owen first. Everything after that, the humble jobs, the quiet persistence, the moment of standing up for himself, was just the natural outcome of that original decision. He'd chosen love over status, presence over prestige, fatherhood over fame, and in making that choice, he'd discovered a kind of education that no university could provide. The wisdom of knowing what truly matters and having the courage to live accordingly. That was the lesson he hoped Owen would carry forward. Not that speaking multiple languages was impressive, though it was, but that being true to your values, even when it cost you everything society said mattered, was the highest form of success. Years later, when Owen was in high school and starting to think about college and careers, he asked his father about that night one more time. They were sitting in their apartment, the same one, though Kyle could have afforded better by then, working on Owen's college application essays. "Dad," Owen said. Pen paused over paper. "Do you regret it? Leaving Geneva? Giving up your career? All of it?" Kyle set down the document he'd been translating and gave his son his full attention. This was important, not just the question, but how he answered it, because his response would shape how Owen viewed sacrifice, commitment, and the choices that defined a life. "No," Kyle said firmly. "I don't regret it. Not for a second." He leaned forward, wanting Owen to really hear this. "Here's what I learned, son. Society teaches us to measure success in money and titles, and how impressive your job sounds at parties. But real success is about alignment, making sure your life reflects your values. My value was you, being your father. So every choice I made, even the ones that looked like failures to other people, were actually successes because they aligned with what mattered most to me." Owen listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "What about now? Now that I'm older and you have more time?" Kyle smiled. "Now I have the best of both worlds. Interesting work that uses my skills, and a relationship with you that's based on years of being present. I didn't miss your childhood for conference rooms. I was there for your first bike ride, your school plays, your broken arm in 6th grade, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference. Those memories are worth more than any negotiation I could have participated in." He paused, then added something he'd never quite articulated before. "And you know what? Being your dad made me better at my work, because I learned patience, the importance of really listening, how to find common ground even when positions seem impossible to reconcile. Every skill I use in translation and consulting, I practiced first at home with you. You made me better at being human, which made me better at everything else." Owen blinked rapidly, fighting emotion. "That's what I want to write about," he said suddenly. "For my college essay, about how you taught me that success isn't about what the world thinks, it's about living true to yourself. About how the bravest thing you ever did wasn't negotiating peace treaties, it was walking away from them to be my dad." Kyle felt his chest tighten with pride. "Write that," he encouraged. "Write about what you've learned from our journey, because it's your story too. You were part of every choice I made." And as Owen bent over his paper, pen moving across the page with purpose, Kyle thought about how everything had led to this moment. The loss and the grief, the humiliation and the vindication, the long years of humble work and the eventual recognition. All of it had been necessary to teach both of them what truly mattered. Education came in many forms. Sometimes it happened in universities and conference rooms. But the most important lessons about love, sacrifice, dignity, and staying true to yourself, those were learned in the messy middle of life, in the choices you made when no one was watching. The full circle of Kyle's journey wasn't about returning to his former glory. It was about discovering that glory had always been a matter of perspective. Standing in a Geneva conference room, translating for world leaders was impressive, yes, but standing in a school cafeteria helping 9-year-olds understand each other was equally important. Wearing a tuxedo at international summits looked successful, but wearing an apron while making pancakes for your son was success of a different, deeper kind. Speaking 7 languages to shock a ballroom full of elites made a point, but speaking the language of unconditional love to your child every single day changed the world in ways that mattered far more. Kyle had learned that education wasn't measured in degrees or accolades. It was measured in wisdom applied, in values lived, in the ability to adapt and grow while staying true to your core. And by that metric, the years since Jennifer's death, the years he'd once viewed as his fall from grace, had actually been his most educational period. He'd learned humility and resilience, patience and prioritization, the difference between what looked impressive and what actually mattered. As father and son worked side by side that evening, Kyle translating a technical document, Owen crafting his college essay, the apartment filled with the comfortable silence of shared purpose. This was the life Kyle had built from the ruins of his old one, not as glamorous, perhaps, but infinitely more meaningful, not as prestigious, but far more fulfilling. He'd traded the applause of strangers for the love of his son, the recognition of world leaders for the pride in Owen's eyes, and he'd do it again in a heartbeat. Because here was the truth that Veronica Hayes had learned too late, and Kyle had learned just in time. The most important education happens in the quiet moments between parent and child, in the choices to show up day after day, in the sacrifice of personal ambition for someone else's well-being, in the courage to define success on your own terms rather than accepting society's definition. Kyle Bennett had spoken 12 languages in his lifetime, but the most important translation he'd ever done was translating his love into a life that showed Owen what truly mattered. And in the end, that was the only education that really counted.